Welcome to another Scripture Saturday. Today's lesson is all on Genesis chapter 4, and I'm not going to read that to you. Feel free to take the time to look at that. But you will recognize the story. It's the story of Cain and Abel. It's the first recorded murder in all of Scripture, and it certainly isn't the last. But the story of Cain and Abel is incredibly significant for us, especially as we look at Genesis 4 from the start to the end. If you are somebody who doesn't deal with conflict well, the reason for that could be seen right here in Genesis 4. What ultimately is at the root of improper conflict resolution with people is the same thing that was at heart with Cain and his brother Abel, and it's pride. It's focusing too much on ourselves and not enough on the overall goal of God, which is for us to live in harmony with Him through faith, but live in harmony with one another through the peace that faith gives us in Him. And what we have is somebody who Cain judges his sacrifice that is made to God and how God responds to that sacrifice based off of how God responds and views Abel's sacrifice. He basically took what God's response was to Abel personally. He didn't look at it from the perspective of what was wrong with my sacrifice or why wasn't God favorable to me with what I offered. He only looked at how God showed favor to his brother. And he thought, if that's how God treats him, then what does that say about me? That if God is valuing my brother and what my brother offered, does that mean I am of lesser value? And the sacrifice I'm making is of lesser value. And he never stopped to question, where is God coming from in this? Maybe the issue isn't my relationship to my brother, which we can kind of get a hint. Maybe Cain had some arrogance or pride on his part as the firstborn of the family, especially if his mother, Eve, was thinking that the promise was made of an heir that would come and undo all of what Satan did. And if she told Cain, you're special, you are the one that God had promised. And then all of a sudden what you have here is Cain hearing, God isn't favoring me in the sacrifice I'm making and instead is favoring my brother. Imagine what damage that did to him, both in his own mind based off of what he thought of himself, but also in how he viewed himself based off of his mother. And what we see here is a complete degeneration of relationships based off of ego, pride, and improper perspectives and expectations. And in this story of Genesis 4, it cost somebody a life. And it wasn't just the life of Abel that was taken. Abel was killed, but he went to go be with the Lord. It was also the life of Cain and the unforeseen circumstances of what that meant for him. There's the instance of the mark of Cain coming, which was a symbol for people, don't do harm to him. And people have debated as to what that is. And ultimately, it doesn't matter. They would have known. But what you have is this cycle of misunderstanding, unrealistic expectations, and lack of faith going from Eve all the way down to her children and her grandchildren. Cain slaughters his brother. Cain eventually has a son by the name of Lamech. Lamech names one of his children Tubal-Cain. And it says, I've killed a man for just injuring me. So if Cain is severely valued and protected by God based off of what he had done, how much more so am I? And you just see this complete cycle of brokenness spiraling out of control. And you would think, man, it's amazing any of us ever survived anything. It's merely a gift of God that all of us are here. And that's true. But what you also see towards the end is there's a short couple of verses of chapter 4 where it says, and Eve conceived again and gave birth to another son. and she called him Seth. And the word for Seth is another word for man, but to a lesser degree. Seth is the one that Jesus descended from, and then ultimately from Adam as well. And what you have with Seth right after this, a lesser degree. So Adam was made in the image of God. Seth was made in the image of his father, Adam. And what you have underneath this declaration that she gave birth to another son is you have this phrase at the end of chapter 4 that it says, and people began to call on the name of the Lord. What does that mean? What it means is people trusted in God. They worshiped God. They sought God's approval, his acceptance, his direction, his provision. So amidst all of this anarchy and chaos with Lamech, the descendant of Cain, marrying two women, that's the first polygamous relationship that's recorded in Scripture, with arrogance and pride filtering from Cain down to his children, with just a bunch of disorder. It says that men started to increase in number and more people were being born. But the identifying factor in all of that was that it was a time where people started trusting in God. And that's interesting because you might think, well, Adam and Eve saw God. They walked with God. God spoke to Cain. He obviously spoke to Abel. So wouldn't it be natural then that people would call on the name of the Lord, that people would trust in his promises? Because it's not like it was that long ago that everything was created and all of this stuff was happening. It wasn't millions or billions of years. At best, it was a few hundred years or less. And yet, there's a difference between people calling on the name of the Lord, trusting in his promises, and knowing of his existence, knowing of his judgment against their race and against the planet because of what their patriarch and matriarch, Adam and the woman, Eve, brought about. It caused utter ripple effects. And that's what conflict does for us. It causes unforeseen consequences that don't just stay in the moment regarding the two people, but end up leaking down into generations that come after us. If there is one thing that I would say that identifies our culture today with what is going on in Genesis 4, is that people are ruled by emotions, bent in pride, and lack the ability to appropriately address and resolve any conflict that comes. People either refuse to deal with it, bury it down deep and let it simmer and make them embittered, or they lash out in an emotional outburst like we see all over the place in our news broadcasts. God desires us to live at peace with each other. He desires us to love one another. He desires us to have concern for one another, which is why he addresses Cain's question with, am I my brother's keeper? And God effectively is saying, yeah. We are not meant to be solitary creatures. We're also not meant to be concerned more about ourselves at the expense of other people. And that's often what's at the heart of conflict. Being focused on the me instead of on the we, and instead of on the him. And yet at the hope at the end of chapter 4 is that people believed. Now, how that affected their lives, we'll see as we explore further in Genesis. But how do you handle conflict? How do you resolve the issues when stuff isn't going your way and it is involving another person? Are you quick to lash out? Do you need time to think? Do you hold on to it? Do you refuse to forgive? What's your mindset towards your brother or your sister? In our world today, people who are upset about things that have nothing to do with them are labeled as Karens. And yet, God identifies it as, no, you're just being a brother or a sister. Now, how that Karen concern manifests itself That's important.